Here are four questions that you should be able to answer if you have done your assignments so far on imperialism. So what are these cartoons illustrating or demonstrating? The answer would be imperialism, the scramble for Africa. How did European nations decide who controlled the parts of Africa? There was a conference in Berlin, Germany, where a bunch of leaders got together. No one from Africa was present. And they sat with a big map of Africa and divided it up amongst them. Number three, why did European nations want control of Africa? Natural resources for their factories, raw materials. They also had cultural reasons such as spreading Christianity or the idea of the white man's burden, that it was their job to civilize, and also for land and power, money. What does imperialism mean? Countries taking over other countries. The man who shared his hut. Not his Pizza Hut. The author of this story is Jomo Kenyatta. You see him pictured on a stamp, and you'll find out why later. This is a little background information. In the 1800s, European nations began dividing up the continent of Africa into colonies by adopting a policy called imperialism. Under imperialism, Africans had little control over their land. Europeans set up their own laws and ruled most of Africa. In the 1900s, many Africans began fighting to regain their freedom. One of the leaders in this fight was Jomo Kenyatta. He was born in 1897, died in 1978. He was a Kikuyu, born near Nairobi, Kenya. In 1938, Kenyatta wrote Facing Mount Kenya, which was a study of the Kikuyu people and culture. In this book, Kenyatta wrote the following tale, a story about the history of imperialism and how European nations had treated Africa. But in this story, called The Man Who Shared His Hut, no European nations are named. Instead, all the characters except one are animals. As you read the story, try to figure out who and what the characters represent. How does Kenyatta describe the relationship between Africans and Europeans? Once upon a time, an elephant became friends with a man. One day, a heavy thunderstorm broke out. The elephant went to his friend, who had a little hut at the edge of the forest, and said to him, "My dear good man, would you please let me put my trunk in your hut to keep it out of this heavy rain?" The man, seeing the elephant's situation, replied, "My dear good elephant, my hut is very small, but there is room for your trunk and myself." The elephant thanked his friend, saying, "You have done me a good deed, and one day I shall return your kindness." But what happened next? As soon as the elephant put his trunk inside the hut, slowly he pushed his head inside and finally flung the man out into the rain. The elephant then lay down comfortably inside his friend's hut, saying, "My dear good friend, your skin is harder than mine, and as there's not enough room for both of us, you can remain in the rain while I'm protecting my delicate skin from the hailstorm." The man, seeing what his friend had done to him, started to grumble. The animals in the nearby forest heard the noise and came to see what was the matter. They all stood around listening to the heated argument between the man and his friend the elephant. In this confusion, the lion came along, roaring, and said in a loud voice, "Don't you all know that I am king of the jungle? How dare anyone disturb the peace of my kingdom?" On hearing this, the elephant, who was one of the high ministers in the jungle kingdom, replied in a calming voice, "My lord, there is no disturbance of the peace in your kingdom. I've only been having a little discussion with my friend here as to who owns the little hut which you see me inside." The lion, who wanted to keep peace in his kingdom, replied in a noble voice, saying, "I command my ministers to appoint a group to investigate this situation and report back to me what they find." He then turned to the man and said, You have done well by establishing friendship with my animals, especially with the elephant, who's one of my most honorable ministers. Do not worry any more. You have not lost your hut. Wait until my Imperial Commission, group of leaders, meets, and then you will be given the chance to state your side of the story. I'm sure you'll be pleased with the ruling of the commission. The man was very happy with what the king of the jungle had said to him. He waited patiently, believing that his hut would eventually be returned to him. The elephant, obeying the command of his master, met with the other ministers and appointed a group to investigate. The following elders of the jungle were appointed to sit on the group of investigation: Mr. Rhinoceros, Mr. Buffalo, Mr. Alligator, the Honorable Mr. Fox, and Mr. Leopard. After seeing who was appointed to the group, the man protested and asked if it was not necessary to include in this group a member from his side. But he was told that it was impossible, since no one from his side was educated enough to understand complicated jungle law. Also, they told the man that there was nothing to fear because the members of the group were all respected animals who will be fair. They also told the man that they had been chosen by God himself to look after races who were not given large teeth and sharp claws. They assured the man they would investigate the matter with the greatest of care and report to the king fairly. The group sat down to take the evidence. Mr. Elephant was first called. He came along looking very proper. In an authoritative voice, he said, "Gentlemen of the jungle, there's no need for me to waste your valuable time in telling a story in which I'm sure you already know. I have always considered it to be my job to protect the interests of friends. And this is just all a misunderstanding by myself and my friend here. He invited me to save his hut from being blown away by a hurricane. The hurricane winds had gone into the empty space of the hut. Because of this, I felt it was my duty, in the best interest of my friend, to turn the undeveloped space of the hut into a more economic use by sitting in it myself. I'm sure you all would have done the same as me, given the opportunity." After hearing the Honorable Mr. Elephant's convincing evidence, the group called on Mr. Hyena and other elders of the jungle to explain what they had witnessed, and they all agreed with Mr. Elephant's story. The group then called the man, and he began to tell his side of the story, but the group interrupted him, saying, "My good man, please only tell us the important details. We've already heard the most of the story from Mr. Elephant and many other bystanders. All we need to hear from you is if the empty space in your hut was occupied by any other animal before Mr. Elephant filled the space." The man began to say, "No, but..." At this point, the group declared that they'd heard enough evidence from both sides to make their decision. After enjoying a delicious meal at the expense of the Honorable Mr. Elephant, the group reached their decision. The man was called back to hear the verdict. The group said, "In our opinion, this argument has come about because of an unfortunate misunderstanding due to the man's inability to think clearly. We believe that Mr. Elephant was fulfilling his duty to protect the man's interests. It is clearly for the man's good that the empty space in the hut was filled by Mr. Elephant. Mr. Elephant found the best, most economic use for the empty space, and that was to fill it, which the man could not because he's too small. We believe there needs to be a compromise between the man and Mr. Elephant. Mr. Elephant shall continue to occupy the man's hut, but we give the man permission to build another hut, which is more suitable for his needs, and we will see that the man is well protected." The man, having no other choice, and fearing that if he refused he might be sentenced to death by the group, did just as they suggested. But soon after he'd built another hut, Mr. Rhinoceros charged in with his horn lowered and ordered the man to leave. Another group was appointed to investigate the matter, and the same verdict was reached as the first investigation. The same procedure was repeated until Mr. Buffalo, Mr. Leopard, Mr. Hyena, and the rest were all living in new huts. Then the man decided that he must try a new method of protection, since the group of investigation never seemed to be on his side. He sat down and said, "Nigenda ti nigagaga motegi," which literally means there is nothing that walks the earth that cannot be trapped. In other words, you can fool people for a while, but not forever. Early one morning, when all the huts occupied by the jungle lords were beginning to decay and fall to pieces, the man went out and built a bigger and better hut a little distance away. It was not long before Mr. Rhinoceros had seen it, and he went rushing in only to find that Mr. Elephant was already inside, sound asleep. Next, Mr. Leopard came in the window, Mr. Lion, Mr. Fox, and Mr. Buffalo entered the doors, while Mr. Hyena howled for a place in the shade and Mr. Alligator laid on the roof. They all began disputing about who had the right to claim the hut. From disputing, they began fighting. And while they were all fighting in the hut, the man set the hut on fire and burnt it to the ground, with all the jungle lords inside. Then the man said to himself, "Peace is costly, but it's worth the expense." And he lived happily ever after. There's a map of Africa, huge continent. Here is a map with a bunch of Africa's natural resources. So you can see why the Europeans, one reason why they wanted land in Africa and the resources that came with it.